It's extremely important to find other people with whom you can share resources, share ideas, and become interdependent with, because none of us can survive collapse alone. That's a recipe for death. This is not about survivalism. This is about building community.
This is Peak Moment. We are living at a peak of human innovation, information, wealth, and health. But we're also at a peak of population and consumption, with rising temperatures and declining resources fueled by cheap oil and gas. Peak Moment Television, bringing you examples of positive responses to energy decline and climate change through local community action.
Hi, welcome to Peak Moment. I'm Janaea Donaldson. My guest today is Carolyn Baker, online in Boulder, Colorado. Carolyn, thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Janaea.
Carolyn is the author of Sacred Demise, Walking the Spiritual Path of Industrial Civilization's Collapse. And she's the principal of Speaking Truth to Power, a website with some very powerful information services. Carolyn, your book has a very intriguing title, Sacred Demise. There's a real tension about those words. Tell us about that.
Sure. It was my intention to insert the tension in the title. I've long been a fan of the famous psychologist Carl Jung, who believed that the universe is comprised of infinite opposites, light and dark, good and evil, joy and sorrow. And even before Jung, the quantum physicists argued that the universe is a dance of opposite forces. All of the great wisdom traditions, of course, of the world agree. Jung taught that opposites should not be polarized, but rather integrated. And that in order to integrate them, we have to hold the tension of them in our minds and our bodies. And in doing this, a third option eventually arises, which facilitates the integration. In more recent times, the organizational development wizard Peter Senge teaches the same principle, that is, hold alongside the current reality a vision of new possibilities. With respect to the title Sacred Demise, the first principle to understand is that industrial civilization is currently in a state of total collapse. This is a process and not an event. It's a protracted process that will take several years, with numerous tipping points along the way, which will exacerbate the process. Life as we know it, based on cheap and abundant fossil fuels and endless economic growth, will cease. The consequences of this will be daunting and perhaps horrific, and at the same time that we know and prepare for this, I believe that it's crucial to hold a vision of a new paradigm and a new way of living in a post-collapse world that will be the opposite of all the things that have created the collapse over the last 5,000 years. And this is what I've attempted to explain in Sacred Demise.
You know, when we think of collapse, the general way of looking at it is like a bridge collapsing, and it's like all over and done in one step. But you just said it's a process, and do you see that it's already happening? And what ways do you see collapse showing up now? What indicators?
Sure. I mean that every institution that you can think of in industrial Western civilization is now crumbling. For example, public education, organized religion, government, finance, transportation, infrastructure, healthcare, law enforcement, the culture itself. All of these are in a state of demise. And they're not just changing or struggling, they're coming to an end. Every parent who has a child in public school knows that public education is circling the drain. We've already had one major financial cataclysm in the fall of 2008, and the most learned economists who've never even heard of peak oil or the long emergency are using the word collapse regularly to describe the state of the world economic system. For example, Paul Farrell, who writes for MarketWatch, back in October 2009, said collapse is inevitable. And in March 9th of this year, he wrote that the collapse of the American empire will be silent, swift, and certain. Some people like Mike Rupert in his new movie Collapse and Richard Heinberg in his many writings are confirming that the concept of endless growth, economic growth, has just hit a brick wall called reality. Endless growth is, by definition, unsustainable. This means possibly living in a world where the only schools might be the ones that groups of parents create in their homes. The only government may be ones that local communities hammer out together to create some semblance of order and structure in a chaotic world. It may mean that the only healthcare available will be alternative modalities offered by individuals or groups of people who have very limited equipment or supplies in order to do their work. Most certainly, in a collapsing world, there will no longer be a money system as we know it, but rather exchange based on an alternative currency or barter, and there will be an extensive underground economy. We have one glaring model of collapse in an industrial society, and that is the collapse of the Soviet Union in the late 1980s and 90s. Many of your viewers are familiar with Dmitry Orlov, who lived through that collapse and has written extensively about it. And I think that his observations and recommendations are very instructive.
Yes, Dmitry talked about the stages and says that we're well along in the collapse of the American empire. And actually, Jared Diamond, in his book Collapse, talks about every civilization eventually collapses. It becomes too complex or outgrows the limits, the limits of their environment. So I want to take us back. I mean, how did we get here?
Well, that's a very, very important question, and I'm very glad you asked it because I'm an historian, having taught history in the college classroom for about 10 years. And I know that if one knows the history of how something occurred, it makes dealing with it much less baffling and paralyzing. The original subtitle of my book was Restoring Life on a Dying Planet. And in the word restore, you hear the word story. The collapse of industrial civilization is a glaring example of a failed story, a story that doesn't work, a story that's unsustainable. And there are several components to this story, such as humans are separated from nature, or humans are superior to nature, or some humans are superior to other humans. Because humans are superior to nature, it is said, nature is there for them to conquer and use as they wish. And furthermore, those resources are endless. If you believe that Earth's resources are endless, then the next thing you're likely to believe is that your economic model can and should grow endlessly and without limits. So from these stories, we make up other stories, like some people are entitled to the resources while others aren't, or there isn't enough money, or there isn't enough of my resources for everyone, so I'm going to build walls and establish armies around my resources, and how you get your resources really isn't my problem. Or because I'm disconnected from nature, I'm disconnected from you. And if I'm disconnected from you, then I don't have to have a relationship with you or communicate with you. In fact, I can dominate you or use you or ignore you. And then there's the other piece, which is bigger is better. And the more nationally and internationally the scale on which we operate, the better. From this comes the madness of globalization rather than the sanity of localization. Now, this failed story actually began when some humans started to ignore, attempting to eliminate the wisdom of indigenous people. Now, besides the fact that indigenous wisdom is grounded in a deep connection with nature, one of the core principles of indigenous wisdom is the initiatory experience. That means that in order for the tribe or race to survive, young people must experience a rite of passage or initiation ceremony at the age of puberty, which takes them to a deeper connection with themselves and with the earth and with the community. It's the responsibility of the elders in that community to make this possible and to keep it happening for all the youth in every generation. The initiation is an important, in fact, life-altering event. And almost always it's a brush with death, which challenges the young person forever and changes them forever. Industrial civilization has rejected the validity of the initiatory process, but that didn't eliminate it. Some people, including Jung, believe that the initiatory impulse is a part of us, even in our DNA, if you will. And Jung argued that if you take away the initiatory experience contained within the community, initiations are going to happen anyway. But instead of happening in the containment of the community, they'll happen through individual and collective adversities.
It seems to me that that kind of collective initiation is what we're facing here with collapse. Martin Prechtel, who worked with Mayan people, said the initiation for their young people was the acknowledgement of the mutual indebtedness we humans have with all of nature, the wind and the soil and the animals, and that if a person did not enter the initiation and that knowing of the indebtedness, they remained a child.
Yes.
It seems like our culture, like a child, is not living with that mutual sense of indebtedness, and so we're going to go through a collapse to get it.
Yes, absolutely. And that's what I'm trying to say in Sacred Demise, is that the collapse of industrial civilization is a collective and individual initiation, and that it must be approached and appreciated in this way. We've been infantilized by consumerism, and our work now is to become adults, and part of becoming adults is to develop that intimate, inextricable connection with nature.
So that sort of looks at that, that's the failed story. What do we see? I mean, that's maybe the lead in, is reconnecting to nature. Is that part of the new story, or what else is in that new story?
Well, yeah, a great deal is in the new story, and the new story is going to be very much the reverse of the story that I just described, beginning with, I'm not separate from nature, but I'm a part of nature. The elements that make up that tree out there that I'm thinking about cutting down are the same chemical components that are in my body. This air that I'm pumping carbon into is the air that I breathe and that billions of other people breathe, and in that air we are all connected. Part of the new story is that bigger is not better, because bigger is not sustainable. Smallness of scale allows for more sustainability, more connection with nature, more connection with ourselves and with each other. And that word connection is the fundamental underpinning of a new story. It's the opposite of separation and individualism and conquest and globalization. I have an entire chapter in Sacred Demise on the new story. And one of the highlights of the book is 2.5 pages in that chapter of a hypothetical new story that I wrote as I considered the aspects of the old story that I've just been sharing. And I've had some readers tell me that they printed it out and keep it in a prominent place where they can read it every day. Part of our work in the collapse process is to make that story and make it happen.
I think that having a vision of the world and the way we want to live is part of what keeps us going and helps us make sense of both sides, the collapsing and that vision. So how do we not see this as just some chaotic, eccentric process, and how do we humans get some meaning in this?
Well, one of the things that I think you're probably asking, inherent in that question, is what is sacred about the demise? Because the demise is sacred. And first we need to look at that word sacred, because one of the meanings of sacred is set apart. In other words, something that's not ordinary, something that's unlike anything else. So the first thing to understand is that this demise is not just another recession or downturn or even crisis. In fact, a couple of weeks ago, New York Governor David Paterson said, we've crossed the Rubicon. We've entered into something beyond a recession. So the collapse of industrial civilization is unlike anything that humans have experienced on this planet throughout their history. Another meaning of sacred is that the sacred thing is connected with something greater than itself. Sometimes people are put off by the word sacred because they immediately assume that it has something to do with religion. Instead, it's more synonymous with the words cherished, hallowed, or revered. For me, there's a reverence and an awe when I speak or think about collapse, because it's a phenomenon like a ferocious hurricane, or a tumultuous earthquake, or a towering tsunami. It's unprecedented, it's global, it's unavoidable, and it will change everything, including perhaps the Earth's geography. And this is not so far-fetched when we consider that the recent 8.8 earthquake in Chile actually moved the Earth's axis a bit. Some people erroneously call this an apocalypse, as if collapse were the end of the world. And what many people don't know is that the word apocalypse comes from a Latin word meaning the unveiling. Notice how many things right now are getting unveiled in unprecedented ways. So it's not an ending, but an unveiling, which can very well lead to a new beginning. Because the human race has never experienced anything like the collapse of industrial civilization. It stands, I believe, at an evolutionary threshold, like Thomas Berry talked about, an unprecedented opportunity to remake itself in terms of values, priorities, and how we relate to each other and the earth. And I can't think of anything more cherished, more hallowed, or more revered than that.
I'm with you. I think it's a momentous time.
Yes.
It is. Can we learn anything from other people about how to journey with that, this process?
Well, absolutely. I see our work now as to do two things, which is, first of all, prepare ourselves logistically and also emotionally and spiritually for this collapse. And secondly, to find meaning in it. If we don't prepare emotionally and spiritually, we're likely to succumb to profound dysfunction or even emotional breakdown. If we do prepare, we may be able to persevere when others who have no idea what's happening are unable to do so. In terms of finding meaning, I need to say that I don't see human beings as machines or organisms that exist without meaning or purpose. Rather, I see humans as connected with something greater than themselves. And this connection, whether we're aware of it or not, gives meaning and purpose to our lives. The more conscious we are of that connection, the more tangible our purpose becomes. Without question, collapse will result in suffering for the entire Earth community. But Jung said that suffering in itself is not the worst thing that can befall a human being. The worst thing that can befall us, he said, is meaningless suffering. And nothing in history, recent history, has made this clearer than the Nazi Holocaust, of which survivors like Viktor Frankl wrote that the people in the concentration camps who were most likely to persevere were those who were able to find meaning, no matter how small, in their day-to-day existence. Those who could not find meaning more quickly succumbed to despair and death. So it's the discovery of meaning and our willingness to pass through this initiatory process consciously because we know it holds meaning for us that is the sacred aspect of the demise. It's the opportunity to become a new kind of human being, a new kind of earth community that the collapse is presenting us with. And what could be more sacred?
Wow. You know, I think that many of the people that we've been fortunate to meet on Peak Moment and people that you talk about on your website are people that are finding meaning in planting seeds for that vision, that new story. What are some of the ways you see those seeds beginning right now in our culture?
Well, I see many people beginning to plant wonderful seeds. Of course, the example that I'm probably the closest to and the most familiar with is the transition movement. I'm working very closely with Transition Colorado here in Boulder. I see, a massive movement now to understand where our food comes from, to develop food security. Um, I see people learning old skills, old new skills that we're going to have, in this new world that is devoid of fossil fuels and where we're going to be forced to live more simply. I see people learning about permaculture. I see people learning about alternative healthcare. I see people talking about developing new currencies. Endlessly, I see people planting these seeds. And of course, the raising of awareness, which is what I'm trying to do, is a very important piece of that.
Well, the seeds that you are planting are some of or the fruit from the seeds that you plant are something that I rely on. Your daily email digest sort of feels like this little snapshot of both collapse that is deepening and new shoots that are showing up that are truly beginning to leaf and bud. So tell our viewers what your seeds are.
Okay, well, as you know, I have the Speaking Truth to Power website at www.carolynbaker.net. All of my books, including Sacred Demise, can be ordered there. And then, as you know, I publish a subscription-based daily news digest 7 days a week, year-round, unless I'm traveling or just not available, which is rare. Even when I'm traveling, I usually manage to publish daily. The digest is a collection of carefully selected and bundled alternative news stories pertaining to collapse and collapse preparation. That is, options for navigating the enormous changes ahead. When I began the digest 4 years ago, most of my stories were from non-mainstream sources. But the realities of collapse are now everywhere in both mainstream and alternative news. People may know that I'm a contributor to the Transition Times, which is a part of the transition movement based here in Colorado. It's an online newspaper which covers transition events and issues all over the world. I'm also offering local and long-distance transition counseling for people who might be experiencing things like foreclosure, bankruptcy, job loss, loss of benefits or retirement, or other transition issues. This is not psychotherapy, but counseling regarding navigating these changes and finding one's purpose amid these losses. For further information, people can email me at carolyn@carolynbaker.net. In addition, I'm offering Sacred Demise workshops, which consist of levels 1 and 2, providing people with an opportunity to come together for a weekend and go deeper into the initiatory process as individuals and as a group. These are very powerful workshops for healing and support for collapse-aware individuals. Anyone interested in having one of these workshops in their area may also email me, and again, the address is carolyn@carolynbaker.net. And then very importantly, beginning April 24th, I'm going to be teaching a 4-Saturday online course for post-peak living on navigating the coming chaos. And this course is going to go more deeply into the contents of Sacred Demise and related collapse studies. The place to register is at the Post-Peak Living website, which is www.postpeakliving.com. Those are some of the seeds I'm planting.
I'd say you're a busy gardener, my dear.
Yes, I am.
Well, I want to thank you for this conversation, and say that your book has some wonderful gems of reflection for people who want to go deeper in themselves, because your emphasis on emotional and psychological preparation seems to me that you're saying if we have that preparation inside, it makes it easier to not get buffeted around by all of the stuff happening around us.
That's a really good point about my book. This is not primarily a book of information. It is it's a workbook. And it's something that you can actually work on these exercises and come back to them repeatedly. It's a toolkit And this emotional and spiritual preparation is absolutely necessary, and very few people are talking about it right now.
Indeed, indeed. Thank you. This has been a wonderful conversation.
Thank you. My privilege, my pleasure.
Thank you for being with me. You're watching Peak Moment, Locally Reliant Living for Challenging Times. I'm Janaea Donaldson, and my guest today is Carolyn Baker, who's the author of Sacred Demise, Walking the Spiritual Path of Industrial Civilization's Collapse. And she's the principal of Speaking Truth to Power website. It's been a good one. If you value these programs, please lend us your support. You can visit us on the web at peakmoment.tv and subscribe to our free email newsletter. Join us next time.